So now that we've seen that banks can create money out of nowhere, and we're going to see that the money supply is very important to the overall workings of the economy and economic activity, it's important to understand how the Federal Reserve works. Now, the Federal Reserve is something that you may not have heard of before, but it turns out is one of the most powerful institutions in the world, particularly when we talk about economic activity. So what is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is a central bank. It's the central bank for the United States. Other countries have different central banks. There's a Bank of England, Bank of Japan, so on and so forth. Our central bank is called the Federal Reserve. It was initially instituted as the lender of last resort. And it's the last place, and when all other things have failed, from which banks can get an emergency loan in emergency situations. And we'll see that becomes really important in times of financial stress. But another thing that banks do is they interact with financial institutions and banks, and in so doing can do monetary policy, increasing and decreasing the money supply and the growth rate of the money supply. So what does the Fed do? Well, the Fed supplies currency to the economy. One of its roles is to make sure there's enough currency out there. So during the holidays, when spending goes up, they get more currency out in circulation. In January, when spending goes back down again, they bring some of that currency in. So they make sure there's enough currency in circulation. They also provide a system of check collection and clearing, so that when you write a check and send it off somewhere and somebody deposits it in their bank, the information can get back to your bank and come out of your bank account. So we've got the Fed provides a system of check collection and clearing. It also, very importantly, holds deposits of member institutions and regulates banks. So your bank has a bank account, in essence. When you deposit money in a bank, some of that is held as reserves, and it gets put in the reserve account for that bank at the Federal Reserve. And it's this function that allows banks, or the Federal Reserve, to conduct monetary policy. Where monetary policy is the range of actions taken by the Federal Reserve trying to influence the level of gross domestic product or inflation. So the Fed, one of the roles of the Fed is to try to stabilize the economy by influencing output and inflation through monetary policy. And they do this by interacting with banks and their reserve accounts. What does the Fed look like? There are 12 Federal Reserve banks. They're spread out all over the country. You see San Francisco, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis, Dallas, Atlanta, Richmond, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Cleveland. And there's also the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. Policy-making groups and regulating groups are split into different groups. We've got the Board of Governors that has 7 members, including the chairperson. You've got the Federal Reserve Banks, and there's 12 of those, so there are 12 presidents. They combine to make up the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the group which is responsible for doing monetary policy. And that's made up of the Board of Governors and 5 of the Federal Reserve Bank presidents that rotate onto the FOMC as voting members, and the rest of them sit in on the meetings as non-voting members, and they make decisions about monetary policy. One of the important factors or features of the Federal Reserve is it's a relatively independent central bank. None of the members of the FOMC are directly voted on by the general population, and the Federal Reserve doesn't directly report to anybody within the government. They are created by Congress, and the Federal Reserve chairman, Board of Governors chairman, reports to Congress regularly on the state of the economy and what monetary policy is being done, but there's no direct, explicit political control of the Federal Reserve, and that allows it to act independently and do things which might be not politically expedient. When we look across around the world, we tend to see more independent central banks tend to have lower levels of inflation in those economies.